All right, so today we're going to be talking about problem specification in week 2. And this week actually closely follows the Lipsy and Wilson chapter 2. So you want to make sure to read this chapter before sitting down to complete the homework assignment for this week. So we went over this slide last week, but I wanted to tie it in again just as a review and as a reminder to set the stage again for the context of meta-analysis and what we're looking for. So these are the types of things that are involved when we do a meta. So we essentially come up with a question that we want answered, and that requires us to review the literature of primary research that is out there and that has been published. And what we do is, in reviewing that literature, we decide what fits our meta criteria that we set, and then what doesn't fit, so we exclude those articles. We combine the statistics that are similar across articles. The statistics are more than likely not going to be identical in every article, but they will likely be similar. So we combine them. We create a standardized effect size, and then so we're creating a statistical summary of that literature. And then in that process, we also identify things that are consistent and or inconsistent in our findings. And then if we find things that are inconsistent, we of course want to try to explain that. So we try to assess for possible contributing factors for that inconsistency. And again, we are not vote counting when we do a meta. So this concept is kind of when you set out to do a literature review for your dissertation. You are writing a very narrative format, you're trying to summarize what's already been done out there, and you're getting a sense of how to structure your paragraphs. And so a lot of the ways that you might be discussing these things is you're probably grouping the articles that you found that say that this is effective together, and you're probably grouping the articles that say this really isn't effective, and here's why these researchers said that. And you're probably discussing it in that manner. So you're kind of saying these 5 said that it's effective, and these 3 said it wasn't. So based on the preponderance of the evidence present, these 5 that say it is effective means it's more than likely effective. So again, we're not vote counting kind of like you might do in a lit review when you're basically looking at stuff. You're actually getting to the root of the problem, and you're finding out statistically what actually is the answer. So for the problem statement, you actually started on this in last week's homework assignment, but now I want you to craft this into a very short and straightforward problem statement. And that problem statement should include these 3 points. So you want to make sure that you specify the literature that your topic covers. You also want to cover your independent variables and your dependent variables. So let's put this in the context of an example. We'll use one of the running examples that I gave you in the discussion forum last week, and this covers a topic that students, the last time this class was taught, did a group meta, and this was their topic. So they wanted to examine the treatment effectiveness of the 2 leading treatments that the World Health Organization says are the best treatments to provide for children and adolescents who have PTSD. And those treatments are EMDR and TFCBT. And so based on that statement alone, this actually specifies most of what they wanted to look at. So it specifies the literature, it specifies the independent variables, so they're looking at a group comparison. They're looking at EMDR versus TFCBT. But the dependent variable still isn't specified in what I just stated to you. So because they want to look at children or adolescents with PTSD, your dependent variable of interest in that case is going to be measuring PTSD symptoms over time. So you want to be looking at what do those PTSD symptoms look like at baseline, and then after they've received both EMDR and TF-CBT treatment. So remembering what the treatment is that you're looking at, what the population is, and what disorder you're looking at, and then your IVs and your DVs. It's also possible that as you continue to look at this literature area in more detail, and you pull up articles and you start reading through things that give you a clearer idea of how to define what it is you're looking at, your problem statement could actually end up expanding. It doesn't always, but it could, so it's helpful for you to know that. So we covered this last week as well, but I wanted to revisit this because talking about these sorts of things are going to be helpful again for you to hear for this week's assignment. So, like I mentioned last week, the first two that are bolded are actually the most common that we see in metas. So, pre-post contrasts, these are not actually the most robust findings, and they're not always used that often. And here's why. A pre-post contrast setup is often used when it's not morally or ethically sound to deny part of your group the treatment that they need. So let's take the most extreme example that comes to mind. So, for example, let's say that you wanted to look at suicidal ideation in adults, and you as a primary researcher tell your subjects, okay, I need you to wait for about 4 months. I need you to sit here on our waitlist control group, and in the meantime, we're going to work with people over here. Okay, so you can see how the fact of the matter is, if we have folks that are presenting with suicidal thinking, ethically, we have to put them into treatment. So the only thing that we can do in this situation is look at their pre-test scores and then compare that with their post-test scores. And there's just no way to really get a comparable comparison or control group in this instance, if this is your topic. The second kind, so group comparisons, we could be looking at two different types of things here. We could be looking at treatment versus control, or we could also be looking at one type of therapy versus another type of therapy. So, like the running example I just mentioned, that group did a group comparison meta, and they wanted to look at, is EMDR or TF-CBT, is one of those therapies more effective than the other for children or adolescents with PTSD? For frequency, again, this does not come up as much, but where it does come up is in forensic populations, and this is commonly looked at when researchers want to know recidivation. So they want to know recidivating rates over time. So does a particular treatment help them to recidivate less after they've gone through the treatment, or is it not helping at all? So what it is you'll essentially be counting frequencies. So how many times did they offend? How many times did they not offend? And so you get percentages of this many percentage of the treatment group recidivated, this many percentage did not, and the same with the control group. So if we think about this from a methodological standpoint, an ideal situation would be to look at control versus treatment in this type of situation. But depending on the topic area, this might not be ethically and morally sound. It's not always great or possible, because what the primary researchers would be saying is, hey, let's make these offenders wait and release them if they go commit a terrible offense, and they could potentially harm others, and then that will help confirm our hypothesis. It's sometimes difficult for these populations to get viable control groups. It is possible. It does happen. It was not common years ago. Within the last couple of decades, it has become more common. And I can talk about that a little bit later in the semester as to why that was. For central tendency, in this instance, this is actually the only time where all of the studies that you look at to analyze have to use the same exact measure. And if we're looking at a mean of a measure, we have to use the same measure or else that score does not translate. So a mean of 12 on the Beck Depression Inventory does not mean the same thing as a mean of 12 on the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Inventory. Those are two very different interpretations. But let's say we were doing a group comparison. It's okay if they use different measures for their construct of PTSD because we can actually combine those stats into a standardized effect size, which we'll talk about later. And then correlation or association between variables. So here you're looking at whether or not two variables are related to one another. So you're looking at the nature of that relationship. So is it positive? Is it negative? Is it strong or is it weak? And here we go on to study eligibility criteria. So these are the things that you need to go through and delineate for me in this week's homework assignment. So again, this very closely follows Lipsey and Wilson Chapter 2, that reading that you'll do, and you'll find this very helpful in completing your assignment. So let's go through these one by one. All right, so distinguishing features. So these are actually going to look different depending on your topic area of the topics that we just covered. So let's say first we're looking at effectiveness of the intervention, effectiveness of some intervention in a meta. You're going to need to clearly identify the boundaries of the intervention. So again, I'm going to use that same running example of looking at EMDR and TFCBT. So if those are the two interventions that you're looking at, you're going to need to define those very clearly. So, what are those interventions? How were they, how and when were they developed? Who were they developed for? What populations specifically? So define that treatment. Here's another kind of broader example. So let's say that you're wanting to do a gigantic meta and you're wanting to look at the effectiveness of CBT for depression in adults. And so there's a decision that you have to make here. How are you going to define CBT? What is it that you want to look at? Do you want to look at all the different types of CBT that are across the literature that might include music therapy, psychoeducation, Beck's model of CBT therapy? So this very specific discussion and operationalization of your variables is essential in deciding what to include in your meta. And let's talk about this too. So if you include everything that I talked about above, so all of those different types of CBT, some people in the field might argue and criticize your meta and say, well, that's like apples and oranges. You included so many different things that you really can't compare. For instance, music therapy is super different from long-term therapy using Beck's cognitive model. What is going to be the meaning that we can essentially draw from this if you expand your search to all of these different types of things? Whereas others might just say, you know what? I think you should really, in order to make this more meaningful, I think you should narrow the types of therapy that you're looking at that are a little bit more similar so that the conclusions that you're making link a little bit more clearly. All right. So let's talk about associations, central tendency, and frequency metas. So here you're going to want to identify your construct very clearly. So how are you going to operationally define what it is that you're looking at? So let's say for association, so correlation. Let's say you're wanting to look at the relationship between well-being and depression. How are you defining somebody's well-being? You want to be very clear. You want to be looking across the literature and seeing how are the mainstream studies defining this, and are you able to capture most of what it is you're wanting to look at? Or are you getting too much and you need to narrow that? You want to be specific about how you're defining that. For central tendency, the main key here is you want to clearly state the measure that you're using, because remember, for this, you'd be using the same measure. So you want to go into detail about who that measure was developed for, like what populations, what the purpose of it is, how it's used, things like that. And lastly, for frequency, you want to be telling me, well, what is it that you're wanting to track a frequency of? So again, let's go back to that example of recidivism. So let's say you're looking at recidivism in sex offender treatment. So you're determining whether or not sex offender treatment is effective based on whether or not people reoffend after they've gone through treatment. So you're going to want to actually consider how you operationally define what counts as recidivating. This is actually defined really disparately across the literature. So can the offender have been rearrested but then released, and also they weren't formally charged with anything, with a reoffense? Or are you actually going to require that they were rearrested and reconvicted? So there are different philosophies on how you define this variable, and you'll want to look at your literature to see what would be the best thing for you to do, because you want to make sure you define that clearly so that when you get to your articles and you code, you want to count the right things you're supposed to be counting so that your frequencies are correct. Okay, research respondents. Be specific, all right? Specify, specify, specify. So who is it that you want to look at? So do you want to look at adults? Do you want to look at children? What is the specified age range that you want to include? Is that from age 18 all the way to 79? Why did you cut it off at 79? Because it's more than likely that populations of this nature are subject to cognitive compromise, as in dementia, so you want to limit it to that. Specify that. Are there specific populations that you want to look at? So can they be clinical? Are you wanting them to be non-clinical? Can they be university students? Do you really want them to not be university students? Should they live in the US? Can they live outside the US? Does it really matter? And then, can they be from any culture? I want you to think about this too, and be mindful when thinking about this, because depending on the dependent variable that you're looking at, this could look different. So think culturally. Are there differences in what PTSD looks like in one culture versus another? You want to know from the literature what the literature says about that, and how culture is viewing that construct and how that differs across cultures. Because if it does, which it does, you'll want to appropriately limit that so that you're measuring that construct well. And key variables. So this is anything else that's going to be a key variable in your study. So identify what else must be present in your study for it to be included, and you want to operationally define them. So this is likely going to involve your dependent variable or any covariates that you identify. So for an example, if you're looking at recidivism, how are you going to operationally define this? Kind of like we discussed before. You can decide that it's only people who have been reconvicted, so you're going to take a very conservative approach, and you're actually going to say, okay, I'm only going to count if they recidivated, if they got reconvicted and actually had to do more time for what they did, because that meant it was super serious what they did. Versus another study might say, well, I'm going to count if they got rearrested, if they got recharged, or if they got reconvicted. So taking kind of a broad approach. So even if somebody was just arrested, but then they went through the investigation and the charges were dropped, so, okay, they didn't actually stick and get a formal offense, but they were at least arrested. They at least came in contact with law enforcement. So to some researchers, that says, okay, they're doing something bad to get flagged by police. That's still important. Or they're getting recharged at least, but it goes through trial and somehow their attorney gets them found not guilty. So that's another way to look at it. And you want to be very specific in how you define these types of key variables, because the more specific that you can be upfront, the easier it will be when you code your articles and the less questions you'll have in that process. Another good example for key variables, this is just kind of, it's not generally, we'll talk about this as we develop your coding manual later on in the term, but another area to focus on in this section would be, only studies that report an effect size or when one can be calculated are considered for inclusion. Because you're going to be coding key variables that are pulling data that help you to calculate the effect size, and you're going to have those specific data types outlined in your coding manual. So if that type of data is not present, it's going to be disqualified from your pile. So a key variable would be, you've got to have either an effect size or the data that you need to calculate one in order for it to be considered. All right. So for research design, here we're looking at RCTs versus non-RCTs. And the question here is whether you want to look at generalizability or internal validity. So randomized controlled trials actually have excellent internal validity. So they are fabulous for controlling those threats to internal validity like history and maturation. But they don't necessarily generalize well because they are so rigid and controlled in how they're set up. So they don't necessarily generalize to Sally, the client who walks into a private practice to receive therapy. It doesn't necessarily translate to that. So on the other hand, if we have non-randomized controlled trials, they'll actually end up losing internal validity. So it's a balancing act to decide what to include when you're looking at research design. If you include both RCT and non-RCT, you'll actually want to include this as a variable on your coding sheet and in your manual so that you can actually compare these two in the analysis. Because if they both end up having similar effect sizes, then this is actually going to be helpful for you to be able to generalize across and say that these findings are consistent, more than likely consistent across these settings. Cultural and linguistic range. So let's look at linguistic range first. So you're going to specify what language you'll need the articles to be written in for you to even be able to read them and code them. And for most of you, that's going to be English. If you are fluent in another language and you can actually understand the contextual nuances of the language when it's written and when it's written in statistics format, you could include those. But remember, when you're thinking about a group project, a group meta, more than one of you is going to code each article. So I'd suggest to sticking to English only. For cultural range, you want to specify what culture you're looking at. So a lot of psychological constructs are going to vary from culture to culture. So again, think about the dependent variable that you're looking at. So you're looking at the outcome of that over time. Does that construct change depending on the culture that you're looking at? Probably yes, depending on what it is. Be mindful of that. And time frame and publication type. So time frame is actually going to depend upon the literature that's available and the history of the variables that you're looking at. So for instance, let's think of therapy. So some types of therapy have actually changed dramatically over time. And so there might be newer forms of the therapy that you're examining. So you're probably not going to want to go back to 1950 and look at that, because what the therapy looks like now is really different than in 1950. So keep that in mind. So you're going to want to set your time frame of the articles that you're looking at and give a justification as to why you've set that time frame. And then for publication type, so for the purposes of this class, you can see at the bottom, we're only going to be looking at published peer-reviewed articles because we're on such time constraints. And you're also going to be trying to get things that you can get full text, because you want to get them and you're going to need quick access to them to be able to code them. If it's not full text, then you're going to want to read the abstract in EBSCO to make sure that it actually has all the variables that you want to look at. And then your group is going to want to order them through ILL really quickly for you to actually be able to code them in time. But for an actual full meta, here you actually have a decision to make when you're looking at publication types. So do you want to look at all the literature that's out there? Do you want to include dissertations, or do you want to exclude them? Do you want to just look at peer-reviewed published articles? There's actually a lot of different rationales for looking at different types of publications. So you want to be clear and specific about what you are and what you are not including. We will cover this actually a lot later in the term, but a lot of folks who do full metas actually really think about trying to include everything. So peer-reviewed publications, dissertations, book chapters, conference presentations, government reports, anything that's out there. So that way you're pulling a representation of everything that is out there to the best of your ability that probably has varying effect sizes. So one of the criticisms, I won't get into it too much, but just for the purposes of this discussion, is that there might be publication bias in meta findings. That's one of the analyses that we do at the very end to determine, is our meta biased? Like, are we looking at peer-reviewed publications that have such high effect sizes that are more likely to get published that our findings are actually maybe skewed and overestimating the actual estimate of what's probably out there in the world? Because a lot of articles might be hidden in the file drawer of researchers' filing cabinets that didn't really get great results. So because they didn't get great results, they didn't submit it for publication, because you know that when you don't find something that significant, it's not really that interesting, so it's hard to publish it. So that's one of the rationales for considering the different types of publication types that you would consider for that. All right, so that covers this week's lecture, and I'll see you in the forums.